Every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. The air in Munich in the late summer of 1972 was deliberately, almost defiantly, light. It was an atmosphere cultivated with immense care and expense by a West German nation desperate to present a new face to the world. The ghost of 1936, of the Berlin Olympics that served as a chilling showcase for the Third Reich, haunted the national consciousness. Those games had been a spectacle of fascist order, of swastika banners and rigid formations, a prelude to the darkness that would soon engulf Europe. Munich was to be the exorcism. It was christened Die Heiteren Spiel, the cheerful games. Everything about it was designed to project an image of peace, openness, and a vibrant, democratic future. The architecture of the Olympic Park itself was a testament to this philosophy. Designed by Gunter Benisch and Frei Otto, its signature feature was the sweeping, transparent acrylic glass canopies that seemed to float like clouds over the main stadium, sports hall, and swimming pool. They were structures of light, not shadow, of transparency, not monolithic power. The official colors were a palette of pastel blues, greens, silvers, and oranges, chosen to evoke the Alps. The official logo, a radiant sun spiral called the Strahlenkranz, was on every surface. This was not the Germany of jackboots and rigid salutes. This was a nation of art, technology, and optimism, a nation at peace with itself and its neighbors, led by Chancellor Willy Brandt, whose policy of Ostpolitik was actively seeking to build bridges with the Eastern Bloc. This philosophy of openness extended fatefully to its security. The memory of intimidating, gray-uniformed Nazi police was something the organizers wanted to avoid at all costs. The Olympic Security Force, known as the Allies, wore cheerful powder blue uniforms and were intentionally unarmed. Their primary role was envisioned as that of ambassadors and guides, helping lost tourists and managing crowds with a smile, not a sidearm. The chain-link fence surrounding the sprawling Olympic Village was little more than a suggestion, a symbolic demarcation that athletes and staff frequently hopped over as a shortcut. It was a tangible expression of the trust that the organizers were placing in the world, an invitation to believe that for 16 days the political hatreds of the globe could be suspended in the name of sport. In the pre-dawn darkness of September 5th, the 11th day of these meticulously crafted cheerful games, that trust was irrevocably broken. A group of 8 men, dressed in athletic tracksuits and carrying heavy duffel bags, approached the 2-meter-high fence near Gate 25A. As they began to climb, they encountered a small group of athletes returning late from a night in the city. The athletes, likely Canadians or Americans, saw the men in tracksuits and made a simple, friendly assumption. These were fellow Olympians who had missed curfew. In a gesture of casual camaraderie, they gave the climbers a hand over the fence. There was no suspicion, no alarm. It was a moment that perfectly encapsulated the spirit of the village. But the men they helped were not athletes, and their duffel bags, which contained Kalashnikov assault rifles, Tokarev pistols and hand grenades, held the tools to dismantle that spirit, piece by painful piece. They were commandos of a Palestinian militant group called Black September, and their destination was 31 Connolly Strasse, home to the Israeli delegation. The attack on Connolly Strasse was not a random act of violence. It was the culmination of meticulous planning by an organization born from a specific and brutal chapter of the Palestinian struggle. The group's name, Black September, was a direct reference to the events of September 1970 in Jordan, when King Hussein's army launched a massive military campaign to expel the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, from his country. The conflict was bloody and devastating, resulting in the deaths of thousands of Palestinians and the forced relocation of the PLO leadership to Lebanon. From the ashes of this defeat, a new, more radical and secretive faction emerged. Black September operated as a clandestine wing of Yasser Arafat's Fatah Party, a deniable instrument for carrying out acts of terror that the official PLO could publicly disavow while privately supporting. Their goal was to force the Palestinian cause onto the world stage through acts of spectacular violence to ensure that their struggle could not be ignored. The leader of the Munich cell was a man who went by the nom de guerre Isa, which means Jesus in Arabic. His real name was Latif Afif. His personal history was a complex tapestry of the region's conflicts. He was born in Nazareth to a wealthy Christian Arab family. He had studied engineering in West Germany, spoke fluent German, French, and Hebrew, and had once worked on the construction of the very Olympic village he was now about to attack. He was articulate, intelligent, and fanatically dedicated. His second-in-command was Yusuf Natsal, known as Tony, a former cook with a reputation for brutality. The other 6 members were young, committed refugees drawn from camps in Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan. They were trained in Libya, and their plan, code-named Ikrit and Baram, after 2 Christian Arab villages depopulated by Israeli forces in 1948, was precise. They knew the layout of the village, they had credentials from workers, and they had a clear, unyielding objective. Their target, the Israeli team, was a microcosm of the nation itself. They were immigrants, Sabras, Holocaust survivors, and veterans. They were husbands and fathers. The head of the delegation was Shemuel Lalkin. The team's living quarters were in a 3-story building at 31 Connolly Strasse, a street named for an American track and field champion from the first modern Olympics. On the ground floor, in apartment 1, were the coaches and officials. Yosef Gutfriend was a 40-year-old wrestling referee, a mountain of a man who had survived the Holocaust. Amutzer Shapira was a celebrated track and field coach, a mentor to Israel's rising star, Esther Shachamarov. Kaha Shor was a shooting coach who had dedicated his life to the sport. Andrei Spitzer was a charismatic fencing master, just 27 years old, who had arrived in Munich only days before with his wife and infant daughter. In apartment 2 were the fencers, shooters, and track athletes, while apartment 3 housed the wrestlers and weightlifters. Moshe Weinberg, a former Israeli wrestling champion and the national team coach, was a man renowned for his strength and confidence. Yosef Romano, a weightlifter, was the father of 3 young daughters and was in Munich despite a knee injury that had forced him to withdraw from competition. He stayed to support his teammates. David Berger, a 28-year-old weightlifter from Cleveland, Ohio, was an American lawyer who had made Aliyah, immigrating to Israel to pursue his Olympic dream. Mark Slavin, at just 18, was the youngest member of the team, a promising wrestler who had recently emigrated from the Soviet Union. Eliezer Halfin and Zeev Friedman were also weightlifters, and Yaakov Springer was a weightlifting judge. These 11 men, along with their teammates who were housed elsewhere, were in Munich to compete, to represent their country on a stage of peace. At 4:30 a.m. on September 5th, the 8 commandos, using stolen keys, attempted to enter apartment 1. The faint sound of scraping metal at the door roused Yosef Gutfriend from his sleep. He went to investigate, and through a crack in the door, he saw the masked faces and the barrels of rifles. Without a moment's hesitation, the 300-pound referee threw his entire body against the door, screaming in Hebrew, "Get out, go, run." His immense strength created a human barricade, buying precious seconds for those inside. Tuvia Sokolsky, a weightlifting coach, smashed a window and fled. Others scrambled for safety. But Gottfried could not hold the door against 8 armed men indefinitely. They forced it open, overwhelming him. Now inside, the terrorists rounded up Gottfried and others they found. They then moved to seize more hostages. Moshe Weinberg, the wrestling coach, was awake and confronted the intruders. He fought back with his bare hands. In the struggle, a terrorist shot him, the bullet tearing through his cheek and lodging in his jacket pocket. Wounded but still defiant, the terrorists forced Weinberg at gunpoint to lead them to the rest of the Israelis. In a final, heroic act of strategic thinking, Weinberg bypassed apartment 2, where the lighter fencers and shooters were, and instead led the captors to apartment 3, which housed the wrestlers and weightlifters. He clearly hoped that the team's strongest men would stand a chance of overpowering their attackers. As the terrorists burst into apartment 3, the sleeping athletes were jolted awake into a nightmare. A fight for survival erupted. Weinberg, despite his wound, again threw himself at the intruders, fighting with the last of his strength. Yosef Romano, the injured weightlifter, grabbed a nearby paring knife and slashed one of the commandos, wounding him. The other strong men joined the desperate struggle. For a fleeting moment, the apartment was a chaotic brawl. But fists and a small knife were no match for automatic weapons. The terrorists opened fire. Moshe Weinberg was shot and killed, his body slumping to the floor. Yosef Romano was also gunned down. He was left to bleed to death on the floor of the apartment, his body later mutilated by the terrorists as a gruesome warning to the remaining hostages. By 5 a.m., the resistance was over. 2 Israelis were dead. 9 were now captives. The siege had begun. The initial hours of the crisis were a blur of confusion. The first official notice came from a German police officer on patrol, who saw a masked figure on a balcony and called out, thinking it was a prank. The response was the cold reality of a Kalashnikov being brandished. Soon after, the terrorists dropped a typed communique from the balcony of apartment 1. It landed at the feet of the gathering police and media. The note laid out their identity and their demands. They were the Black September organization. They demanded the release of 236 Palestinian militants held in Israeli prisons, along with 2 notorious German left-wing militants, Andreas Baader and Ulrich Meinhof, founders of the Red Army faction. The deadline was 9 a.m. If their demands were not met, they would execute a hostage and continue to do so until every prisoner was freed. The German authorities were thrown into a state of shock and utter unpreparedness. The crisis management team that quickly assembled was composed of West German Interior Minister Hans-Dietrich Genscher, Bavarian Interior Minister Bruno Merck, and Munich's police chief Manfred Schreiber. Schreiber was a respected police administrator, but he and his team had absolutely no experience in hostage negotiation, tactical assaults, or counter-terrorism. The entire security philosophy of the games had been to prevent exactly this kind of scenario by creating an atmosphere where it was thought to be impossible. Their only available strategy was to play for time. They needed to extend the deadline, to establish a dialogue, and to somehow find a solution to a problem for which they had no precedent and no training. As the sun rose over Munich, the Olympic Village became a global stage for a new and terrifying form of theater. The television cameras, already present to capture heroic athletic feats, swiveled to focus on the grim facade of 31 Connolly Strasse. The image of a terrorist in a light-colored fedora and a black balaclava, peering menacingly from the balcony, became an instant, chilling icon. This was the birth of modern televised terrorism. The world was not merely being told about the crisis, it was watching it unfold live. This unprecedented media presence was a double-edged sword. It gave the terrorists the international platform they craved, magnifying their message and their power. It also put the German negotiators under an unbearable microscope, with every move and every minute of inaction broadcast globally. The terrorists themselves had access to a television inside the apartment, giving them a surreal, real-time view of the police movements and media reports outside. The German negotiators, led by Schreiber and Genscher, made contact with the terrorist leader, Issa. Latif Afif proved to be a formidable adversary. He was calm, articulate, and unwavering. When the Germans offered him an unlimited sum of money for the release of the hostages, he reportedly laughed. When they offered to substitute themselves, high-ranking German officials, for the Israeli athletes, he flatly refused. His focus was absolute, the release of the 236 prisoners. It was a demand the Germans were powerless to grant. That power lay in Jerusalem, with the government of Prime Minister Golda Meir. In Israel, an emergency cabinet meeting was convened. The nation had a long-standing, ironclad policy, no negotiations with terrorists. To give in to their demands, the government believed, would be to set a dangerous precedent, inviting a wave of similar attacks and kidnappings. It would be a strategic capitulation that would endanger Israeli citizens everywhere. Golda Meir's message to the German government was blunt and unequivocal. There would be no prisoner exchange. However, Israel did make a crucial offer. They proposed to immediately dispatch a unit of Sayeret Matkal, their highly secretive and exceptionally skilled Special Forces unit, to handle the rescue operation. This was a unit trained specifically for these types of high-stakes hostage situations. The offer, however, placed West Germany in a deeply uncomfortable political and legal dilemma. The post-war West German constitution, drafted with the explicit intention of preventing any future military aggression, severely restricted the use of the army within Germany and forbade the operation of foreign military forces on its soil. Accepting the Israeli offer would mean violating their own constitution. It would also be a profound national humiliation, an admission to the entire world that Germany was incapable of managing a crisis on its own territory. Chancellor Willy Brandt, after consulting with his cabinet, formally rejected the Israeli offer. The decision was rooted in law, sovereignty, and national pride, but it would prove to be a catastrophic mistake. It left the German police, who were neither trained, equipped, nor structured for such a mission, to face a group of hardened terrorists alone. With the diplomatic and military options exhausted, the German strategy devolved into a desperate attempt to buy time and hope for a tactical opportunity. They successfully negotiated several extensions of the 9 a.m. deadline. Noon came and went, then 1 p.m., 3 p.m., and 5 p.m. Each extension felt like a small victory, but it was an illusion of progress. During this period, the crisis team devised a half-baked plan to storm the building. The plan was codenamed Operation Sunshine. A team of about a dozen regular German police officers, disguised in athletic tracksuits and armed with submachine guns, were to infiltrate the building through ventilation shafts and underground passages. Their objective was to launch a surprise assault on the apartment. The execution of this plan was a tragic farce. As the disguised officers took up their positions on the roof of the building, their movements were clearly visible from the ground. The hundreds of journalists gathered below aimed their cameras and long lenses at the unfolding secret operation. The terrorists, who were watching the news coverage on the television inside the apartment, saw the entire plan play out on their screen. Issa appeared at the window, enraged. He threatened to immediately execute 2 of the hostages if the police did not withdraw. The Germans, stunned and humiliated, had no choice but to call off the assault. The blunder was monumental. It had not only failed, but it had also completely destroyed any element of surprise the authorities might have hoped to achieve. It showed the terrorists that the German police were amateurs, and it further emboldened them. This fiasco also reinforced a critical intelligence failure. The Germans continued to operate under the mistaken belief that there were only 4 or 5 terrorists, a number they had gleaned from initial chaotic observations. The true number was 8. Any future tactical plan would be based on this fatally flawed assumption. Inside the apartment, the 9 hostages endured hours of terror. Their hands were bound, and they were tied together in a line. At one point, the terrorists brought André Spitzer, the fencing coach, to the window to show the negotiators he was alive. Spitzer, who spoke German, was able to have a brief, supervised conversation with Interior Minister Genscher. He reported that the hostages were fine, but that the terrorists were losing their patience. Later, he was allowed a 2-minute conversation with his wife Anki, who had been brought to the scene. It was a heartbreaking exchange, a few precious words of love and reassurance in the face of death. The image of Spitzer, his hands tied, standing at the window in his undershirt, became another of the day's indelible images of human dignity under duress. As evening approached, with no progress on his original demands, Issa made a new one. He demanded a fully fueled airplane to fly him, his commandos, and the hostages to an Arab capital, specifying Cairo, Egypt. To the German crisis team, this felt like a godsend. It moved the crisis away from the crowded, chaotic Olympic village and offered them a new, more controllable environment for a rescue attempt. They readily agreed, but it was a ruse. They had no intention of allowing the plane to leave Germany. The new plan was to ambush the terrorists at the airport. The location chosen was the nearby Fürstenfeldbruck NATO air base. The trap was set. The plan for the ambush at Fürstenfeldbruck was conceived in haste and executed with staggering incompetence. The core of the plan involved a Boeing 727 passenger jet parked on the tarmac. A team of German police, disguised as a Lufthansa flight crew, would be waiting inside. The idea was that when the terrorist leaders boarded the plane to inspect it before takeoff, the disguised police would overpower them. Simultaneously, police snipers positioned around the airfield would eliminate the remaining terrorists on the tarmac who were guarding the hostages and the helicopters that would transport them from the village. It was a classic ambush scenario, but its success depended on precision, coordination, and accurate intelligence, all of which were fatally absent. The first part of the plan collapsed before the terrorists even arrived. The 17 police officers assigned to hide inside the Boeing 727 were plainclothes patrolmen, not a specialized tactical unit. They were armed only with sidearms. As they sat in the dark cabin of the plane, they discussed their mission and concluded it was suicidal. They felt they were underarmed and had no viable plan to successfully engage a group of heavily armed terrorists in a confined space. Without informing the Central Command Team, Genscher, Merck, and Schreiber, who were in the airport's control tower, the officers collectively decided to abandon their post. They quietly left the aircraft. The command team, looking out at the tarmac, saw the Boeing 727 and assumed the ambush team was in place. They were completely unaware that the plane was now empty, a hollow and useless prop in their unfolding drama. At approximately 10:30 p.m., 2 Bell UH-1 helicopters, carrying the 8 terrorists and their 9 bound hostages, touched down at Fürstenfeldbruck. The airfield was bathed in the harsh glare of floodlights, a decision that tactical experts would later criticize, as it created difficult shadows and could impair the vision of the snipers looking out from dark positions into a brightly lit area. As the helicopters landed, Issa and his second-in-command, Tony, emerged. They walked toward the waiting Boeing 727 to conduct their inspection. As they climbed the stairs and entered the cabin, they were met not with an ambush team, but with an eerie, empty silence. They saw immediately that it was a trap. Their reaction was swift. They turned and sprinted back towards the helicopters, screaming, "Treason, deception," to their comrades. The ambush had been exposed. This was the moment the German authorities should have initiated their assault. But their tactical setup was a disaster waiting to happen. The German command had positioned only 5 sharpshooters. 5 for 8 known targets. This was a flagrant violation of basic tactical doctrine, which would call for at least 2 snipers per target. Furthermore, these were not truly snipers. They were regular policemen selected because they were proficient marksmen in shooting competitions. They were not trained in the specialized skills of coordinated fire, target acquisition under stress, or communication. Their equipment was tragically inadequate. They were armed with the standard Heckler & Koch G3 battle rifle, a fine military weapon, but not a precision sniper rifle. Crucially, the rifles were not equipped with any telescopic sights or night vision scopes. The snipers were aiming with iron sights in the inconsistent, shadowy lighting of the airfield. And in perhaps the most critical failure of all, they had no radio communication. The 5 snipers were unable to talk to each other or to the command post in the control tower. They were 5 isolated men, forced to make life-or-death decisions independently, without any coordination. One sniper was even positioned directly in the line of fire of his colleagues, a placement so dangerous it was almost unbelievable. At approximately 11:03 p.m., the fragile standoff shattered. A police officer, either on his own initiative or because of a misunderstood order from the tower, opened fire on one of the terrorists. The shot missed. Immediately, the airfield erupted into a chaotic, ferocious gunfight. The snipers began firing at whatever targets they could acquire. They managed to hit 2 terrorists near the helicopters. The remaining terrorists, now under heavy fire, scrambled for cover, using the helicopters and the hostages inside them as shields. They returned fire with the full force of their Kalashnikovs, spraying bullets across the tarmac and toward the control tower. The German police were pinned down, unable to get clear shots without endangering the hostages who were tied up and helpless inside the 2 aircraft. The firefight dragged on, a desperate and disorganized exchange of fire in the dark. The German command team, realizing their sniper plan had failed, called for armored personnel carriers to be brought to the scene to provide cover and firepower. But even this was botched. The APCs had been dispatched, but were stuck in traffic and had no radio contact with the command post to get clear directions, arriving agonizingly late. When they finally rolled onto the tarmac after midnight, their arrival seemed to trigger the final, horrific phase of the massacre. Seeing the armored vehicles approach, one of the terrorists understood that their situation was hopeless. He ran to the door of the Eastern helicopter, which held hostages Friedman, Halfin, Springer, Berger, and Shapira. He sprayed the interior with his assault rifle, executing the 5 men where they sat. He then turned to the second helicopter. Inside were Gutfried, Schor, Slavin, and Spitzer. The terrorist tossed a hand grenade into the cockpit. The resulting explosion was immense, a brilliant, roaring fireball that engulfed the helicopter and incinerated the 4 men inside. Amid the chaos of the explosion and the renewed firefight, a stray bullet struck and killed a German police officer, Anton Fliegerbauer, who was positioned near the control tower. The battle lasted for nearly 90 minutes. By the time the last shot was fired, around 12:30 a.m. on September 6th, the tarmac at Fürstenfeldbruck was a scene of utter carnage. All 9 of the remaining hostages were dead. 5 of the 8 terrorists had been killed. 3 were captured wounded but alive. The rescue attempt had not just failed. It had culminated in the deaths of everyone it was meant to save. In a final cruel twist, the world was initially told a lie. Just before midnight, a German government spokesman, Konrad Ahlers, who was not at the airport and was receiving fragmented third-hand information, held a press conference. He confidently announced that the rescue operation had been a success and that all the hostages were safe. The news flashed across the globe. For a brief, joyful hour, the world celebrated. Relief flooded the Olympic Village. In Tel Aviv, people poured into the streets, dancing and singing. But it was a phantom joy, built on a foundation of chaos and misinformation. The grim truth began to emerge in the early hours of the morning, finally confirmed by sportscaster Jim McKay on the American ABC broadcast with the now famous mournful words, "They're all gone." The aftermath of the massacre was a period of global shock and mourning. The Olympic Games were suspended for 1 day, during which a memorial service was held in the main stadium. The ceremony was tense and sorrowful, but IOC President Avery Brundage's declaration that the Games must go on struck many, especially the victims' families, as profoundly tone-deaf and disrespectful. The decision to continue the competition felt to some like a desperate attempt to pretend that the spirit of the Games had not been irrevocably broken. The final insult for Israel and the grieving families came just 53 days later, on October 29, 1972. A Lufthansa Boeing 727 was hijacked by a Black September team who demanded the release of the 3 surviving Munich terrorists. The West German government, haunted by the bloody failure at Fürstenfeldbruck and terrified of another hostage crisis, capitulated almost immediately. The 3 captured terrorists were flown to Libya, where they were greeted by cheering crowds and held a press conference, proclaiming their victory. They would never face justice for the murder of the 11 Israeli athletes and the German police officer. This release, however, triggered a secret and ruthless response. Prime Minister Golda Meir authorized Mossad, Israel's intelligence agency, to launch Operation Wrath of God. This was a clandestine campaign to hunt down and assassinate every person believed to have been involved in the planning and execution of the Munich attack. Over the next 2 decades, Mossad agents carried out a series of targeted killings across Europe and the Middle East. The operation was a grim testament to Israel's unwritten policy of retribution, a long and bloody epilogue to the 16 hours of terror in Munich. The anatomy of the Munich hostage crisis is, therefore, the anatomy of a systemic, multi-layered failure. It was a failure of imagination on the part of the organizers, who believed that the Olympic spirit alone could shield them from the world's violent realities. It was a failure of intelligence, which left the German authorities blind to the true nature of the threat they faced. It was a failure of political will, which saw national pride override the tactical necessity of accepting expert help. It was a catastrophic failure of command, control, communication, and equipment at the crucial moment of confrontation. From this comprehensive failure, however, the modern world of counter-terrorism was born. Elite units like Germany's GSG-9 were created specifically in response to the disaster. Protocols for hostage negotiation and tactical assault were written, using Munich as a textbook case of what not to do. The world of international security was fundamentally and permanently altered. The Carefree Games were over. Munich was the horrifying lesson that proved that no event, no matter how noble its intentions, is immune to the violent currents of history, and that in the fragile space between peace and conflict, miscalculation is the anatomy of catastrophe. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.